taxes. They fund roads, healthcare, education, and wars. Paying them has long been a fundamental part of the social contract. But are taxes effective in redistributing income and building a fairer society? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
I'm not that heartless. So I wouldn't mind if the government asked me to contribute a few extra bucks to help the poor.
We are forced to pay them. It's not a voluntary action.
When we have inequality getting out of control, this certainly brings problems for society in which, the poor hate the rich hate the poor.
How is he making $1 billion a day? How did he get there?
Today's debate, is it time to rethink taxes? I'd like to welcome our guests. Martín Krause is a former professor of economics at the Faculty of Law in the University of Buenos Aires. Sanjit Dhami is a professor of economics at the University of Leicester. Pedro Solimano is a journalist at DL News covering the cryptocurrency space. And Gustavo Flores-Macías is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to have you, and I'm excited about this debate. So we are sitting in Argentina right now, in beautiful Buenos Aires, but people get pretty passionate about this topic wherever they are around the world. So let's start big. Is it time to rethink taxes? I'll start with you, Martín. Kick us off.
It always will be, at least until we get rid of them.
Okay, until we get rid of them. So the ball has started rolling. Who wants to pick it up? Pedro, is it time to rethink taxation?
Yeah, I think fundamentally for sure. The idea of that taxes are just something that we have to pay blindly, no matter how institutions operate, no matter what sort of public services we're getting in return, seems a little outdated. I understand the argument for it, and I'm not completely against abolishing it, but I do think that we need to rethink them and rethink the technologies around them, rethink why we're paying them, what for, who's receiving them, in what amount. It's a long overdue conversation.
I'm glad we're having it. Gustavo.
Well, I think we're always having to get taxation right, and it's important to think how to do that. And this is why we see reforms over and over in most countries. But I do think that taxation is important for at least three reasons. The first one has to do with paying for government services, paying for things like infrastructure, for public safety, which most people can agree are essential functions of the state. And maybe other aspects like education or healthcare that not everyone agrees should be something that the state is involved in. But the second reason has to do with it's a tool for redistribution, and I know this is also controversial. And the third one is about the link between taxpayers and government that taxation generates that gives people a stake in the system, and it also prompts a sense of government accountability or the need for government accountability. So I would say that these three aspects of taxation are important, and certainly we should always be thinking about how to get them right.
Martín, you gave a short answer that kicked this off. Would you like to elaborate now that you've heard two different positions?
Yes, I would like to go, let's say, to the end of the argument, and that is, I would raise two issues here. One is, why is it good to use coercion against people? If we do that as individuals, we'll be criminals and going to jail. Now, the government does that, and it is legal. Why it is different from what we can do? That on the one side. On the other side is that taxes, let's say, they get more difficult to develop the process of capital accumulation, which is the one that has lifted so many people out of poverty in the last 200 or 250 years. We should think that in, let's say, the end of the 18th century, 90% of the population was poor. and today it's only 10% of the world population. So all that process has been driven by the accumulation of capital, by the increase in productivity in labor, and increase in incomes. Taxation reduces that. So my question will be, why are we willing to reduce that process of wealth creation and improvement for all, particularly those who are in the bottom?
Sanjit, we heard Martín use the word coercion there. And so from a behavioral economic point of view, do you see that as coercion? Why do people actually pay their taxes?
Yes, so fundamentally, taxes capture a human desire to redistribute money from the better offs to the ones who are not as good off. Before governments came along, societies had various ways of redistributing income. The church performed that role for a very long time. Going back to hunter-gatherer societies, where there were no taxes at all, there was a great amount of redistribution happening. In these societies, they critically relied for their survival on hunting meat at regular intervals. Now, it could be that a few hunters were successful in finding prey, but others were not. The ones whose families had not, the hunters who did not find the prey, their families would starve. So they developed powerful norms of sharing. So sharing resources from the better offs to the worse offs is a very fundamental human desire. Taxation is a mere modern manifestation of it. How high the taxes should be, what kind of taxes we should have, that's a slightly moot point relative to this deep underlying human preference. And insofar as taxes can perform a role in satisfying this underlying human preference, we might still see them for a long time yet.
I think a problem there is the scale when it comes to it, because hunter-gatherer societies were much smaller than, I don't know, Argentina has 54, 55 million. I'm from Chile, we have 20 million. And so obviously when you have a small community of hunter-gatherer, I don't know how many there were, but I can imagine considerably less than the millions that are now, then it makes sense to sort of pool resources. Sharing becomes something a lot more like tangible. Whereas now, and I think I understand the argument for people who say, well, if I'm living in the north and there's somebody in Patagonia, why am I going to send the fruit of my labor halfway across the country when I can't even seem to find how my taxes are getting used here? So I think that's something that we need to also take into account, which is the scale of societies, how big they've become, when you're also putting in this conversation about taxation, because it's not as simple as just a church in a small community somewhere just redistributing to a few families, or a large village or something like that. When you're talking about millions of people, and you have people in Buenos Aires that have to send to Mendoza, that have to send to Patagonia, to Salta. And so I think that obviously makes the I'm not going to say legitimacy of taxes, because I think that's too harsh, but I think it makes that the sort of justification a little bit more difficult, because you can't see it to the degree that you could way back when.
Perhaps one way to think about it, I think scale is important, certainly, but governments at the end of the day are meant to solve collective action problems, and these problems, the larger the size of the group, the harder it is to coordinate. So one would argue that with smaller groups, maybe you don't need a central authority to coordinate, but the bigger the group, then this coordinator body becomes more important. And as societies become larger, I think there's a case to be made that then the function of the government becomes more important, and we need resources to fund those governments, and taxation would be a way to accomplish that. I would also like to add that in the context of, say, economic growth and prosperity, I think it's true that we have had, I think we've made considerable progress over time. But I think it's also important to consider the role of government in this prosperity. And markets require certain rules and certain order to function correctly. And I think, take financial markets. If there isn't oversight in terms of proper disclosure, then these markets can break down, or there can be, misrepresentation and so on. This, of course, happens, but with certain rules and enforcement, it becomes harder. So these essential roles that governments serve for markets to function and that play a role in prosperity, I think taxation becomes important in supporting these efforts.
Martín.
I think we have two different levels to discuss here. One is the efficiency level, or the economic argument about the need of a government and taxes, which is usually relies on the concept of public goods, the supply of public goods. We may go into that later if you want. But then there is a moral issue as well. And I raised the issue before, which is what justifies the use of coercion against other people. Why do I use the word coercion? Well, that's the typical definition of political science regarding what a state is. It is the one with the monopoly on the use of force. Any one of us who use force will be going to jail probably. Now, the government does it and it is legal. So my concern and question is why? Why is that? Why is that? Well, you have to answer. One, it was mentioned to you in your opening, which is, well, there is let's say, a social contract to generate this institution that is government. I have a lot of questions about that. When did that happen, that social contract? And was it agreed in a unanimous way? What about the people who disagree with that? So you force them into paying taxes that they don't want to pay.
Do you disagree that there is a social contract?
I don't think that you can prove that there was any social contract. And there is another question. If there was, at some point in history, a social contract, why should that social contract restrain us now when we were not part of that? So I think that is difficult because, and you have half of the library in political philosophy on one side and one on the other. You can find people like David Hume arguing that the origin of the government is not any social contract, but violence by the more powerful in order to take control of the rest. So this is up to debate also. What is the origin of the government, which eventually charges with taxes?
Okay, so this idea of coercion has come up again, and I love it. I want to explore that a little bit more because there's a clear point of view that this is coercion. Pedro, is that how you see it?
I agree. I think that the monopoly on the threat of violence, I wouldn't say necessarily the use of violence, but the threat of violence is definitely a key factor, because there's a lot of people, and I do think that that's a fundamental wrong of the state, or something that I don't think that it should have, at least blindly. And yeah, I do think that having that coercion or coercive action is definitely a problem, but I understand that its existence, because otherwise, what do you do? Because when you talk about moral obligation, there's also a moral obligation to pay taxes, whether you disagree or you agree with it. I know that if I pay $100 worth of tax, I know that maybe one will go to a public school or one will go to a hospital, just a small trickle. That's a moral obligation I have with the rest of society. We might disagree with the origins of the social contract and where it became and the illegitimacy of the state, but there is a moral obligation that I have, or that I believe that I have, with the people who are lesser off, that I should be helping out or participating in society. whether that should be necessarily through the government, through state, through one big centralized authority, I think that you can definitely decentralize things. I think you can federate them. You can create some sort of autonomous organizations, whether that's regional, whether that's at the municipal level. There's a bunch of different ways that you can play around with it. But I do think that there is a moral obligation to sort of help out, because the system also disfavors a large proportion of the people. And so there needs to be some way that that same system gives back to the people that they're also sort of taking away or draining from.
Mm-hmm. He brought up a moral obligation. Is that what you see based on the research? Is that why we do it?
I agree. And you see, try to imagine a world where there were no taxes. How would you fund the social services? Now, in the West, for instance, the social welfare state really took off after the Second World War. In the UK particularly, so the NHS came along, free healthcare at the point of delivery. It was free education to children. It was associated with massive increases in living standards across the Western world, which were unprecedented. And they went hand in hand with developments in how governments would raise enough tax revenues in order to fund these growing services. Now, obviously, there are partisan differences in terms of how big the state should be. In the US, there are well-known differences between Democrats and Republicans about the size of the government. But I don't think anybody is really arguing that we should get rid of taxes altogether. I mean, that's an argument that one doesn't often come across, because one takes as given that government programs of various sorts are necessary for a just and fair society that we all desire to live in. After all, none of us would want to live in a primitive society where these programs were suddenly absent, where people wouldn't get access to healthcare, education, basic facilities. How are these going to be financed if not for taxation? So I suppose the debate really is, what kind of taxation? At what level should people be taxed? State or the federal level, for instance? What should be the mix of taxes? Income taxes or consumption taxes? Should we be taxing wealth? How much of the tax evasion that we actually do observe in the real world is something that we can control with actual policy? So I think those are some of the relevant debates to think about.
Martín, I have to go to you with that. Do you agree or disagree? Should we reframe this debate?
Well, as I said, and I would like to go somewhat deeper on that, there are two issues here. One is the moral one, the other is the economic one. Let me end with the moral one. I think that and I agree that we have a kind of a moral duty to concern for those who are in a bad situation and condition. Now, and let me bring this into a kind of a story. Let's suppose that I die and I go to heaven, and at the door of heaven is St. Peter is there. He certainly is going to ask me this. Okay, he's going to say, in order to get into here, you please answer to me, what did you do for the others, for the poor, for those who are in need? And then I start getting nervous, and I think, what can I say here? And then it comes to my mind, well, wait a second, I pay taxes, and with the taxes there were a lot of social programs that help the poor, build houses, etc. St. Peter is going to say that those resources were taken from you coercively. You did not pay voluntarily, and whenever you could, let's say, evade in some way, you did. So I'm sorry to say, but that argument will not open the door of heaven to you. Okay, so please wait there a second. Then comes on the same position, comes the government official in charge of the social plans and social policies. He is asked the same question, and he also said, oh, well, I did a lot of things for the poor. I run all these social programs that help the poor. And St. Peter is going to say, oh, wait a second. That was made with someone else's money who was taken coercively from their pockets. And I'm asking you what you did for the poor with your own money, with your time, and with your own effort. So you are not getting into as well. Go there is someone else waiting. So what I mean with this is that none of us get a moral justification about what is done with taxes because we are forced to pay them. It's not a voluntary action, which I certainly regard as superior in a moral way, that we voluntarily take our money and help the poor, and we go and help the poor, not the government, us.
Can I just come in on the fact on the coercion issue?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we do have an element of choice, and that element of choice comes via voting for different political parties who have different platforms on how high the taxes ought to be. So in the US, for instance, the Republican Party is considered to be the party of lower taxes. The Democrat Party is considered to be the party of higher taxes. So part of the coercion argument is weakened by me then deciding with my vote which of those two parties to elect. So if I think I'm being coerced into paying taxes that are too high, then in the next elections, I might go and vote Republican so that the taxes go down. So there's that issue. The other thing is that despite a lot of social programs being undertaken through taxes, there's a great proportion of social programs that are also taken up through charitable contributions. Now, these same individuals who are paying supposedly high taxes then are paying extra money in charitable contributions to fund more private social services. So I think we observe a mix of it, and we're not as helpless as some of the comments would suggest. We still have an element of choice, a bit of maneuver room, if you will.
I also think that there's a couple of things that, for example, in the US, and you know this, you tell the taxman how much money you made last year. You do your own taxes. So you also have a choice there to tell them how much you made, and you can sort of, to a degree, decide on how much you want to get taxed. And so there is also an element of choice there. I've worked for many years as a freelancer, and in Chile, I also had the choice. Okay, I can decide to avoid taxes, evade taxes, and there's also a choice that I make there. And then there's a second order, which is, if we leave this all to voluntarism, and we get to decide how much we provide or how much we give, that's going to separate the gap or segregate the gap even further, if you ask me. Like, I come from Chile, one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have a Gini coefficient of, last time I checked, like 0.44 or 0.43, something like that. And if there was no, and you can see the absence of the state there, and you can see that gap just growing and growing and growing. And so you have to think to yourself, all right, if you eliminate the state completely, what's going to happen to that whole bunch of people? And there's also an element of coordination, like you were saying before. There is a sort of, if I have to choose how much I give to which social services I give, to who I give it to, what areas of the community or of the city I live in, that's also going to create a whole array of concerns and of things that I have to take into consideration. Whereas if I just pay tax, maybe that can sort of solvent where those resources get allocated. So there's also that element that Gustavo was saying before of coordination that also makes for a smoother redistribution, I think.
For the non-economists, I just want to jump in here. For the non-economists watching and listening to this, the Gini phrase that you mentioned and the inequality, can you explain it for us?
Yeah, I'm sure Martín can explain the Gini coefficient better than I can, but it's essentially a way to measure inequality in a specific country or in a specific society. And there's a whole ranking of countries and a whole ranking of what goes into it. And Chile consistently placed among the top. And yeah, you can see it there. And the segregation is very, very real. The poor hate the rich hate the poor. It's something that, even though we have misleading GDP, misleading metrics, you can sort of feel it on a cultural level on the street, that there's that sort of divide. The Gini coefficient is just another way to measure inequality in a country.
I want to pick up on the inequality, and Gustavo, I want to bring that to you because earlier we heard this beautiful moral quandary question that I also kind of want an answer from you on how you see what Martín brought up. But we're living in a time when the richest 1% hold nearly half of the world's personal wealth. And I can't even say that sentence without a little bit of disdain, but I wonder, is that a problem?
Yeah, I think the moral question is very important. But let me take a step back and say that public policy is always necessarily an exercise in choosing the least bad option, right? So rarely do we get to pick ideal scenarios and see them through. And we can maybe think of an ideal world in which we would have government services that are effective and equal opportunities for people to succeed in life, and we have then no taxation also perhaps, and people can decide whether they help others or not, and ideally they would. But the reality, I think, is complex. And if we take out taxation, which would bring the coercive aspect necessarily, then I think that world wouldn't exist. I think the system would break down. And I want to point to then more the externalities, or sort of maybe the more concrete material implications that this would bring. And I think we would have to picture a world in which maybe these government services are absent because no one is there to provide them, and individually it wouldn't make sense to bear the cost of building these roads or big airports or whatnot. But also a world in which redistribution might just not happen at all. And one can say, well, one should be free to decide whether one redistributes your own wealth or not, if you have it. But there are externalities, and I think this was implied in the conversation that, and in the question, when we have inequality getting out of control, this certainly brings problems for society in which, the poor hate the rich hate the poor. And there are parts of the world in which we see this even with some role of government, right? There are societies in which different sectors of society don't recognize each other as legitimate parts of that one society, which is certainly problematic to achieve national goals. And it leads to a world of it could be insecurity, it could be affecting business, it could affect prosperity. So it is true that ideally taxation would imply coercion, but I think the alternative could be a world of chaos and extreme inequality that I think we also wouldn't want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Martín, you painted a picture of this world of the afterlife. We just heard Gustavo paint a picture of what some would call a dystopian reality if we didn't have taxation. So I'm wondering from you, what does a world without taxation that's coercive look like?
Well, that is... I'm quite interested in that, but that means speculations about the possible utopia. Say, I don't know how that could that be. I'm going to the bottom of the concept. We can after that think about an ideal situation in that sense, and how would those services that we now receive from government could be supplied in a different way. Let me tell you on this side that what is now part of the social policies is something brand new in the history of humankind. It must have 150 or 200 years. So we have had many societies where that was not the case, and all contributions were mainly voluntary. I can tell you this: it is usually supposed that the welfare state filled a vacuum. That wasn't it was not the case. Let me tell you briefly, in the story of Argentina, we started having an inflow of immigrants from Europe at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. There was no welfare state, and this was where all poor people coming in, attracted by the opportunities that the country was giving at the time. And when they arrived, what they did if there were no social programs and no help for the poor, they organized themselves in societies, charity societies, of societies for mutual help, where they cover all the needs of the members, and all that we all call welfare was part of that voluntary organization. So when the welfare state then took over those organizations, at the time in Buenos Aires, there were more than 1,200 friendly societies that were organized, most of them through the origins of there were Spanish, there were Italian, there were German societies, there were all kinds of that. If you go around this city, you will find the German hospital, the British hospital, the French hospital, the Spanish hospital. And where did all this come from? Well, there were the communities that actually built the hospitals at the time, because there was no public or state hospitals. So there was an incredible amount of social activity and help for other people. I must say, and I'm going to let you go on after this, and I can go back to this. I am not concerned with the differences in income, and I don't think that's an issue. I'm concerned with those who are at the bottom, and how could this at the bottom can get better. If the differences are higher than that, so what? I mean, Elon Musk made $1 billion yesterday. Fine, but I'm concerned, are the poor are getting opportunities to go up or not? I don't mind about the others. And if they make that lot of money, fine. It's going to come back to us either through consumption or investment in one way or the other. But what's happening with those? Are they going up? Probably the differences are larger.
So very briefly, because I like that's a little grenade on this table, that you're not concerned with the differences in income. But before we get there, how then do you solve for what you are concerned about, which is, are the people at the bottom rung doing well enough?
Well, first of all, there are three ways that you can help the poor, or let's put it the way markets help the poor. First of all is the best from an economic perspective and from a moral perspective, which is jobs, having opportunities for jobs. That's the best way that people will make themselves out of poverty, not by helping them, giving them money, but actually allowing them to earn their own money, which is good not only for their living, but also for their self-esteem, let's say. So one is that. The other is the one that I mentioned recently, that is the mutual cooperation. People organizing themselves to supply themselves with all kinds of services and needs. And the third is philanthropy. All of us giving and helping the poor. Why do I say that? Well, I did it before. I don't think that using the coercion of government to do that gives us any moral approval, because eventually we were forced to pay taxes. We did not contribute to the poor voluntarily. We just tried to avoid being sent to jail, and that was it.
Sanjit, I could see you trying to get in earlier, and I'm wondering if you want to touch on the idea that Martín raised about, in the absence of the state, people still came together. There still seemed to be this idea that we owe each other something, and so it will find a way. Is that true?
I've already spoken about that in my opening remarks, that before taxation came along, the church used to be one coordinating actor through which money used to flow into a direction that, people desired, which is, towards people who were not as fortunate. And I've spoken about hunter-gatherer societies. So indeed, it is the case that, redistribution and other social welfare programs could be run without taxation, and they have been for most of human history. But, there are serious coordination issues with it at the level of a national state. How do you coordinate, for large countries, actions of, small groups of individuals? How do they make a decision? How much money should Argentina be spending on defense? So how do you make that sort of a decision? And once that decision is made, I think points been made before, these are public goods. These are not worth for any individual or a small group of individuals to finance. And that calls for more coordinated action. And the state provides one such avenue through which these actions could take place. Now, we've spoken about inequality. Just to give you some brief figures for your listeners. So in the UK, if you look at the incomes of the top 20% and incomes of the bottom 20%, before you engage in redistributive taxation and social benefits, the top 20% earn 12 times more than the bottom 20%, 12 times. But once you've engaged in redistributive taxes and social welfare programs like free education, free school meals, disability insurance, unemployment insurance, and so on, this gap is only 5 times. Now, there's an argument about efficiency. Does that necessarily make the people in the top 20% work less and so contribute less towards the national cake? That's an efficiency argument. The fairness argument is, what kind of society do we want to live in? Are we happy living in a society with extreme income inequality or not? Now, on that, there is a range of partisan views.
Gustavo, what kind of society do you want to live in?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I just want a prosperous society where, people are not worried about others, trying to steal their wealth. But I want to maybe make a point that taxation is compatible with what we would think of as a small government. But even for a small government, one requires a level of taxation to fund whether we believe that the government should only be in the business of providing public safety and only, let's say, providing order for markets to function. Even those things require taxation. Governments need resources. But the roads that we drive on, those are expensive. We need to maintain them. That's something that private sectors individually would have a very hard time doing if they wanted to scale. But I also don't have a problem with, say, tycoons or Elon Musk making a lot of money and making billions a day. I think that's fine. But the challenge is, take the city of San Francisco today. That's a place where increasingly there's a lot of very visible wealth inequality. And you have, luxury cars driving by homeless encampments in the financial district. So it is a situation that I think is leading to an exodus of wealth out of the city. And it's maybe a way to imagine what society would look like if we let inequality get to a point in which everyday life becomes just so difficult for even the middle class, not just Elon Musk, that everyone is leaving those places instead of coming into it and investing in them. So I think that to me, again, even beyond the moral question, I think there's a very practical issue that economic prosperity and inequality are compromised if we let inequality get out of control.
Yeah, can I just add to that point? So the data does not show that inequality is correlated with growth rates. So it's not necessarily the case that if you're more or less unequal, you have high or low growth rates. So in terms of countries' growth rates, it doesn't seem to make a difference. But it seems to make a big difference to the social fabric of the country. So high inequality is associated with low levels of trust, with high levels of imprisonment, with greater incidence of teen pregnancies, and so on. So, and social strife. People develop envy. People who are not as well off might be envious of people who are the have-nots and the haves. So it can lead to all kinds of social tensions. And the higher stress levels and lower levels of mental health in more unequal societies as well. Now, if we claim that, inequality is something that I can live with, then I have to be willing to factor in the social costs of some of the things that I've just mentioned.
Pedro, can you live with those social costs?
So most of you made some pretty compelling points, and I think it's important to address one of the big ones, which is I think inequality and the differentials between the people that have and the have-nots is probably one of the most insidious problems that we have. Because I also don't have a problem with Elon Musk making $1 billion. I guess I do have a problem with him.
I thought you did. Earlier,
yeah.
I called it a grenade.
Yeah.
I meant it was being lobbed this way.
Yeah, no, I do think that's pretty insane that he can make $1 billion a day, because I think we also have to ask, how is he making $1 billion a day? Like, how did he get there? You know, like it doesn't make much sense for somebody, because he can obviously, I mean, he walks through the hallways of the White House. He goes and meets with parliamentarians around the world. Like, so, I mean, how did you make that $1 billion a day? But then there's another problem. What's the gap between him making $1 billion a day and the workers on the ground floor that are building his electric cars, that are building his robots, that are building his satellites? And like, if I look at it and I'm making minimum wage and I see the person above me making $1 billion a day, and I think to myself, well, that's just wrong. And like Sanjit was saying, like, there's going to be envy. You're going to start to feel these very visceral things that are unavoidable. Obviously, if like the bottom bit of my Maslow hierarchy of needs is covered, obviously I don't care that much about the differentials, because I don't have to worry about like having those sort of basic things to cover. But if I'm living in poverty or squalor, or seeing my boss make magnitudes more when a lot of that is coming from what I'm adding in, then I'm going to say, okay, there's something wrong here. There's something that needs to change. And then you can also, and then to kind of throw a curveball, you can kind of question the role of the state there, because the state enables that, you know? And so you think to yourself, all right, where are lawmakers? Where is regulation closing that gap, making for that sort of big divide to not exist, or to sort of clamp down on the ceiling and then sort of raise that floor? Because then you see all these parliamentarians that are making, I don't know, $10,000 or dollars a month, and they're talking about raising the minimum wage to 500, 550. I mean, I don't know where they live, but 550 isn't enough to live barely anywhere. So I think that differential is a big problem.
Well, let me take your analogy a little bit further. So say you're at the bottom, you are sweeping the floors of that factory. Then does it placate you if you know that the corporation or the person who leads that corporation is paying some taxes, and those taxes are going to help you the roads and the bridges? And then does it make you even angrier when you know they're not paying the amount of taxes you believe they should be paying?
I think it would definitely make me angry. I think, or maybe furious is more the word, just because I do think that there is a problem when it comes to taxation, is that it's hard to see, you know? And to Gustavo's point before, or maybe kind of against it, like there's, when you drive around Chile or Argentina, the roads are pretty much a mess, you know, especially like we're here in Capital Federal. So things actually, like, depending on where you go, there's some sort of basis for things to work, and things are okay. But as soon as you get outside, like, roads get pretty dismal. And so you think to yourself, all right, if the basis for the state is to build roads, as it always has been a trope for many, many years, why is there holes everywhere, you know? And so, but back to your question, I do think that obviously it would infuriate me to know that the person that makes $1 billion a day is making a big loop around. And I think that there's something that doesn't get talked about enough, is how a lot of billionaires or asset owners actually avoid tax, which is they use their stock and they borrow against their stock. And so that doesn't trigger any capital gains tax. That doesn't trigger any income wealth tax. So I'm Elon Musk, and I have 1 billion shares of Tesla, and I go to the bank and I say, I want $10 million. I'm going to put up my stock as collateral for that, and the bank is going to give me the $10 million. And I don't have to pay any income tax, any wealth tax. And that's something that very, very few people know outside the high net worth individuals, ultra high net worth individuals, corporations, or banking system. And that's a fundamental problem that most people overlook, and that taxation doesn't necessarily fix when it comes to income wealth or income inequality.
Mhm. So in the very unlikely scenario in which I become a billionaire, how do I do it? How do I decide to give just enough to stay within this coercive system, but not enough to get in trouble?
So the rich have honed finally the game of tax avoidance. So if you look at the top 0.01% of the rich in the West, they are able to hide about 25 to 30% of their income at a minimum.
Wow.
And this is very important because we talk about income inequality. The figures I gave to you on income inequality in the UK, which is representative of the West, were based on people's actual reported incomes. What about the incomes they don't report? Income inequality would be extremely high in that case. So the rich would then make 25 to 30% more income than they actually show in the papers. So tax avoidance is a very serious problem. And I think we're going to talk about that at some point, and how do firms do it, and what kind of cooperative strategy.
Let's talk about it now. Is it a serious problem first, Martín? I'll get that from you. Do you see it as a serious problem?
You mean the income inequality?
The tax avoidance or evasion, or the ability to find a loophole that means you aren't giving to the social good.
Well, but it seems to me that in this conversation we are assuming that politicians are angels and they are striving to achieve the common good, the public good. So first, I would like to know what is that common good, and second, those are real people, and you know how they act. They are not angels. So starting from the assumption that they will be trying to achieve a common good is kind of a fantastic, I would say. That's not how it happens. They follow the same principle as we all do. They pursue their own interest, and that doesn't necessarily is a coincidence with ours. So let's talk about the real world and what politicians do with our money. Is that a better use that they do with our money than the one that I would use that money for? I don't think so. I think I would trust the people to help each other much better than expecting someone else in a position like that and with power like that to help the poor.
I think there's also a big problem when it comes to territorial differences. So the rich tend to, and I speak a lot biased because of I'm from Chile, and so I'm going to speak a lot to that. The rich live in four, at least in Santiago, in 4 neighborhoods or 4 boroughs, and they have barely any contact with the rest of the metropolitan region. And so when the idea of I know where to put my money better, but if all I'm doing is surrounding myself with all other rich people who have all their needs covered and that only are interested in their specific neighborhood, well, then all you do is continue to widen that gap, you know? And then if you look at it on the other side of the coin, you see the poor who don't have that many resources, who think to themselves, all right, where can I penny pinch this, penny pinch that, put money here, put money there. And so there's also that big question there's also that big issue, which is, well, if I don't have any contact with the middle or lower classes, how do I, in the end, actually begin to understand, okay, I can put money towards them because that's what they need. I've never been to maybe to the public hospital, so I don't know. I've never been to a public school. I've always thought an interesting idea because I actually, to your point, Martín, politicians who are the ones that decide where you allocate resources around society. Why don't we send politicians that they have their compulsory for them to only go to public hospitals, for them to send their children only to public schools, for them to only use public transport, so they can see it, and they can see it firsthand. They can witness and feel the problems that the public system has, And then I'm sure we're going to start to see some considerable changes have. But if they all live in their nice private estates or wherever they live, making vast amounts of money, sending their kids to private schools and all that sort of stuff, of course nothing's going to get fixed, especially if we're just paying them their salaries and that nice, lavish lifestyle.
Well, Pedro, if we're sending them to the public hospitals and public schools, I feel like we should also send them to the wars, which so much of our tax money, at least in the United States and other industrialized countries like that, are going to fund. So, Gustavo, I'll give this to you. Do you think that we are giving too much credit to these politicians? Are we thinking of them as angelic beings who are doing the good of the world?
I think most people would have a hard time thinking of politicians as angelic beings, and for good reason. But the issue of evasion is very important, and it's something that is often thought of as tax morale, or sort of what shapes people's willingness to pay taxes. And there are two very important factors for this. One is a sense of fairness, that people around me are also paying their fair share. And the other is the results, the outcome of those taxes, what I get back in return in government services. And if either of those two is failing or missing, then people will have a harder time thinking that they should be contributing into the system. And effectiveness, in a place like Latin America, you often see a big gap between the quality of the roads, the quality of public education, the quality of public safety, and what people are putting into the system. And this is certainly something that undermines the sense that taxes are working toward the public good. Other parts of the world, less so. And Scandinavia is a famous example in which people say, well, cradle to grave type of system in which you're taken care of, or the government takes care of you throughout. And people, you understand that it's the responsibility to pay those taxes to get those relatively good services in exchange. But that we cannot take that for granted. And I think it's important then for people to work to hold those governments accountable. But this is true of all government functions, not just the taxation side of things. And to the extent that one is putting into the system, there should be an interest, and at least theoretically there is, of a sense of accountability. And I'll just say that across the world, comparatively, countries where, let's say, natural resource wealth is important, a place like Venezuela, for instance, there is much less of an accountability connection between citizens and governments, because people say, well, a lot of the money is coming from that natural resource wealth, not necessarily from my taxes they should be put to work by the government.
Sanjit, we heard the mention of Scandinavian countries, and I know that there's research that's been done on how they view taxation, especially when it comes to the common good. What is that research, and why doesn't it extrapolate beyond Scandinavia?
So I think there are quite strong differences in views between European countries and Scandinavian countries in particular, and the US on the other hand. So there's this more support for higher taxes, redistributive taxes within Europe and Scandinavian countries relative to the US. So why is that? Now, when you actually do surveys in the US and you ask people, how do you think people become rich? Is it due to luck or is it due to hard work? Now, the questions are obviously slightly more nuanced than that, but that's the crux of the difference between the two sets of questions. And then you go to Europeans and Scandinavians and ask exactly the same question. It turns out more Europeans believe that becoming rich is due to luck rather than hard work. More Americans believe that it is due to hard work rather than luck. Now, obviously, if you believe that the source is luck, then you'd be happier to engage in more redistributive taxes. And that's one reason why Scandinavian countries and Europeans go for higher taxes and the US goes for lower taxes. Can I just come back to a previous point?
Please.
I just wanted to complete a point on evasion versus avoidance. Now, evasion is the withholding of taxes in an illegal way. Avoidance is the withholding of taxes in a legal way. So you might argue, what's the problem with that? Why should we as a society approve or disapprove of that. That's a legal activity, let it go on. Now, in Britain, 63% of the people disapprove of tax avoidance despite it being entirely legal. In Germany and France, that figure is about 35%. So people do frown upon tax avoidance, even if we cannot all fully agree on how productively those tax revenues are eventually going to be spent. Evasion is a different kettle of fish, and I think some of the points have been raised before. Social norms are very important, and they can both improve evasion and also go the other way. If I live in a society where I see most of the people are corrupt and evade taxes, I'm more likely to do so. If I live in a society where I observe most other people paying taxes, I'm going to pay my taxes. So social norms can cut both ways. And social norms are inertial. It's very difficult to change social norms once they get established. And some of the factors that go towards changing social norms is for governments somehow to increase a perception of fairness in the way the tax revenues are being spent. So there's lots of public messaging going on in Western countries in which the government would say, look, here are the tax revenues, but here's how we are spending them. We are accountable. And that public messaging aspect is extremely important to generate more faith in the tax system and for social norms to operate in a beneficial way.
Martín, I'd love your thoughts on that.
I want to refer to something that was raised before, and with regard to countries like Sweden, one thing, or the Nordic countries, one thing that we must take into account is that they charge high taxes to individuals, but very low to companies. Company profits are taxes much lower in Sweden than here in Argentina. So, and one may wonder why. Why do they do that? For a simple reason. The persons, the individual Swedes want to stay there. It's their culture, it's their society. So they have this, let's say, social contract now, even though I criticize that, but they have some kind of an agreement that, okay, we want to live in this society where we pay a lot of taxes and we get a lot from the government. But companies are different. Companies compete worldwide, and they cannot stay in a country that will take 60, 70, or 80% of your revenues or your profits. They would move someplace else. So what these countries like Sweden do, forget about that. I'm going to charge you much lower taxes for you to stay, and that's what happened in those places. The other thing is that I wanted to comment is let's take, okay, I agree, don't take Musk as an example, because I know he may have some favors from government. So let's take an hypothetical billionaire entrepreneur. And my point here is that when he made the $1 billion, he has already contributed to the poor and to mankind. For one reason, I would say, for one reason, because all those people working for him or her, in this case, would be in a worse position were it not for this investment and this entrepreneurial building. I mean, he has created new jobs, which by definition are better than the other options that these people have, because otherwise they would have gone to work someplace else. If they are working there, it is because they are thinking, between all the opportunities that I have, this is the best for me. Otherwise, they would be going someplace else. So I'm exaggerating here, okay? But I'm gonna classify. I'm gonna name that kind of people. They are benefactors when they are entrepreneurs and they are creating value and creating jobs. They did already all the let's say the social contribution that that we want to have. If they after that even, which the rich people, particularly in the U.S., does, if after that they even give away part of the wealth to charities, well, that's a second step. Fine, that is great. but it was great the first one as well.
Okay. I have to know what this side of the table thinks of that. The jobs, by virtue of the fact that they are giving an opportunity for people who need jobs, is that benefit that the billionaire is making, he or she?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think it is important that tax systems are structured in a way that they allow for that economic growth to take place through free enterprise. And I think that's very important. I don't think we want tax systems that inhibit or prevent that growth from happening, because it means job creation. It means, the benefits of, I know we're moving away from the Elon Musk example, but just thinking about electric vehicles, for instance, as an innovation and being able to bring them to market at the scale that they have. And then the innovation that might happen down the road out of that first step. Or anyway, I think those things are really important and really valuable. So we should not lose sight of those. And this is why I think that the way we structure tax systems is important, such that we make sure that we're taxing enough to cover for the goods and services that we think are important. And again, every society might think different things are important. That we also have a sense that they're contributing to some redistribution that keeps things moving in an it's conducive to this economic growth as well, and that it doesn't. Typically, these systems should be designed in a way that is neutral with respect to economic activity, in the sense that, the market should decide what types of industries become more profitable and so on. That is, these are general principles as to how to design a tax system. And then we can debate what type of ways of taxing are better. But the question of tax evasion, I think, is connected to the issue of tax design. And if we generate tax systems that are too onerous, then we're also creating incentives for this evasion and people to, have these incentives not to declare their wealth or their economic activity. So, this is bound to happen in any case. But to find the right level of taxation that continues to encourage economic activity, but also helps with some of these other goals of public goods and services provision and redistribution as well.
May I have a brief comment on?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that if you find tax evasion, it has to do with there is a graphic, very well-known graph in economics called the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve says that if you go on increasing the tax rate, you're going to increase the amount of money that you collect, but at some point you're going to start taking less because the taxes are destroying the economic activity. It seems to be that most of the developed world is over that limit in the Laffer curve, and that it would be better for those countries actually not to. Why that happens is because if you increase taxes, you are killing economic activities that become non-profitable anymore.
So less investment.
Exactly. Particularly investment, particularly the accumulation of capital, which I said at the beginning is the key for progress.
Well, a couple of points. I mean, first, tax avoidance in corporations is an extremely serious issue. So, and this is organized through a variety of means. So they have shell companies in different countries, and they would show a great deal of the economic activity happening in countries with low tax rates. Okay. So, for example, if I'm Google or any other big brand name company, you pick your favorite brand name, and operating, let's say, in various parts of Europe, I could show that my head office is in Ireland and they have the branding rights to my company. Then every year I pay immense royalties to them, and I'm essentially transferring profits from other European countries into Ireland where the tax rate is lower. So it's called transfer pricing. Or I make a loan from one of my subsidiaries to another and charge a 200% rate of interest. So companies are pretty smart when it comes to tax avoidance. Now, there's a range of views on corporate taxes, and rightly so. It's a very vexed topic. But companies are not waiting around to see how those debates pan out. They already have been very proactive in reducing their tax liabilities. And so there's been recent OECD cooperation in which they're not willing to accept a company which pays less than 15% tax in any country. Okay, so let's say there's a company that operates in France and in the UK and then in a country that gives zero tax rate. So if this company is showing most of its profits coming from a country with zero tax rates, then France and the UK now have a right to tax this company for 15% of its income originating in the country where the tax rate was zero. So companies have become smarter, but governments have also become smarter in trying to deal with tax avoidance. On the Laffer curve, I think that's a very important point, and I think we ought to know where that comes from. So in the post-war period, there was rapid growth in the West, and things were pretty hunky-dory until the 70s. And, we had the big OPEC shocks. Oil prices went up, and the growth rate in Western countries fell phenomenally. Now, countries which are used to seeing very high growth rates then suddenly find themselves in a situation where, things are hitting rock bottom. Then the US got Ronald Reagan, UK got Margaret Thatcher's gifts, and they had this idea of a Laffer curve. Essentially, let's reduce taxes to increase economic activity. This was an extremely counterintuitive idea. The idea was that if we tax the rich less, they're going to work harder to produce more wealth. Mm-hmm. The empirical evidence did not support the Laffer curve. It's a discredited idea. In the 80s, the growth rate in the UK and the US did not go up despite massive falls in the tax rate. So I think we have got to be a little bit careful on that. The other issue is, how does society view how high the tax rates are? In the US in particular, there is something called polarization of reality. Taxes, corporate taxes and income taxes, that's public information. Everybody knows how high they are. But you go ask a Democrat and you go ask a Republican, how high do you think the tax rate is? You get very different answers. How high is income inequality? You get very different answers. You cannot even agree on the objective reality out there. That's polarization of reality. And then the next step is obviously what to do about it. And again, there's greater polarization there, and we can perhaps come to that point later.
On what to do about it, Pedro, I want to go to you because Sanjit, you mentioned several things there, and one of them, laypersons might call this the trickle-down economic theory that limiting taxation on the elites and on the wealthy would benefit the middle classes, the lower classes. What's your take on whether or not that worked?
I mean, I think the idea of trickle-down economics, it's not an economics major or anything like that, has been pretty discredited, both in the US and around the world. Even though I do think that, like I said earlier, I know that when I pay a little bit of taxes, there's going to be a trickle that goes to hospitals, that goes to education, that goes to all these sort of things. But the idea of trickle-down economics and giving the elite or the high class or whatever you want to call them some sort of tax benefit because they are creating jobs, because they are investing in different countries. I mean, why don't you give those same tax benefits across the board to a person in every single tax bracket? Why are just this small percentage of people getting this benefit? And I'm not a hater of entrepreneurs at all, or like I'm also a big believer in free enterprise and in innovation and all these sort of things. But the idea that you have to give these sort of breaks to these high net worth individuals or corporations or anything, because it's eventually going to trickle down in some way or the other to the middle and the lower class. It's been disproven, and it doesn't make any sense. And all it does is that they continue to amass wealth, and they continue to hide it in different places, and they continue to use geographical arbitrage and buy new passports and use all sorts of different mechanisms so that they can hide their wealth. So I don't know. Yeah, it's been a while actually since I've heard of the concept of trickle-down economics. Like that feels like it's not even part of the conversation anymore, because it's just doesn't make much sense.
Mm-hmm. Martín, I want to go to you with something that Pedro mentioned, and it's this idea that you raised earlier of the fact that an individual is creating jobs, that being a good thing. Does that translate to corporations as well? Is the fact that corporations are bringing massive jobs and job opportunities to people, does that then mean that they shouldn't be taxed?
Of course, that as long as we have governments, you need to have some source of revenues for the functions that they may have. What I was therefore taxes may fall in individuals or companies or other sorts of organizations that may be around in a society. My point was that this trickle down effect is exactly what has been going on for the last 250 years. And lifting all the people, I said this before, at that time 90% of the population in this world was poor, and now it's only 10%. Why did that happen? Because of a process of accumulation of capital, more productivity, and higher income. So this is the basic process, and taxation reduces the whole process. So that's why I am critical of taxation. You know?
So you see progress.
Don't you?
I am in the wonderful position of getting to ask the questions and not have to answer them.
Okay.
But no, I wonder. I don't think I do see progress. Gustavo, what about you? Do you see progress? Do you think we are heading in a good direction?
Well, I think, across nationally, there is evidence that countries overall are better off than they were in terms of economic standards of living, compared to 100 years ago. And that, even if internally, so the distribution of wealth internally, there's so much variation across the world. But overall, sort of, the state of affairs in most countries is much better now than it was, say, 100 years ago. One thing that I think is important here is that, I think of history as a pendulum in terms of whether, say, the role of government becomes out of favor or it comes back in. And we're certainly we're in the middle of a time in which industrial policy and a greater role of the state is becoming more and more fashionable. And I think it has to do with the sense that maybe the policies that were that became generalized in the 80s and 90s, we can think of them as neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus and so on, that they didn't quite work for a lot of people, and that a lot of people were left behind. So we have this, both, there's a tension between the two, but both can be right. So we can overall have this prosperity historically, but internally, there are some sectors in most countries, but certainly in the developed world, that have felt that prosperity is just not reaching them. And we see this in the United States today. We see this in Europe. But let me just make a point about the perils of over-taxation, over-regulation. We are in the middle of, with technology and AI, there is so much opportunity that is coming online, let's say, that is becoming possible and available. But we see important differences across countries. And Europe, it's so interesting to see that that Europe, in part because of this high tax levels and high regulation, seems to be lagging compared to places like the United States or China or other parts of the world. And we just need to be very mindful of this because we see real evidence in Europe of stagnant levels of economic growth. And there's something to this question, even if the Laffer curve may not quite work every time. There is evidence that companies will move to jurisdictions with lower tax rates, and that it plays a role in economic decisions historically and geographically. So this is something to be mindful of when we're thinking about the right types of taxes to put in place and the right types of systems so that we don't discourage economic activity, but we still accomplish these goals of redistribution and public goods provision.
Sanjit, I'm wondering, based on the research you know about and that you've done, is there a difference between the willingness of those haves to pay taxes versus those who feel like they are without, the have-nots, some would say, to pay taxes? Do we see a difference?
Well, there's more support for redistribution amongst the poorer than the richer. I mean, that comes out from US data very, very clearly, and from elsewhere too. Now, at heart of the issue is, what are governments doing to deter tax evasion at the individual level? So if you look at the Western world, for instance, for an amateur tax evader, the probability of being caught evading taxes is just 1 to 5%. Just
Sanjit, I'm taking notes here for the amateur tax evader. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So if, let's say, your ordinary Joe decided to evade taxes, say £100 of taxes, let's say, then the probability they'd be caught by the government is between 1 to 5% only. So very small percentage of the tax returns are actually audited. I believe in the US, it's about 4% of the tax returns audited. The rest are not even audited. So it's a gamble. Now, what happens if you're caught evading taxes? If you're caught evading taxes, the government says, could you please pay back the taxes you owe to us? That's one. Second, the government levies a fine on you. How high is this fine? So if you look across the Western world, and I'd include New Zealand and Australia in that, the fine is between 0.5 to 2 times the taxes evaded. So supposing you evaded $10 in taxes, then you're not going to pay a fine of more than $20, including the $10 that you evaded. Now, these are extremely weak deterrence parameters. And it begs the question of why anybody would ever pay individual income taxes. And of course, my income is withheld at source in the university. I'm in this happy position as not having to make such a decision. But for people who receive payments in cash, let's say, they have to make that decision. Should they report their incomes or not? You could calculate the returns from evading taxes with such weak deterrence. The return is about 95 to 98%. You'd struggle to find an asset with such a high rate of return. Yet most people, when given the chance to report incomes, do report incomes. In fact, only 30 to 40% of the people evade taxes when given a chance. So we've spoken about issues of morality before. So there's an issue of internal morality. Am I going to be a responsible citizen and pay taxes or not? The answers to that is going to depend on which part of the world you live in. In the Western world, where, say in the UK, where the tax system is perceived to be a lot more fairer than some of the other parts of the world, not fully fair, but fairer, there you're more likely to pay taxes.
Martin, I can see you shifting. You look like you have something you want to add.
No, well, two things I would say. One is that the tax, let's say only tax illusion, it's a healthy thing because it puts countries or jurisdictions in competition among themselves. Because as he said, capital will move from one jurisdiction to the other, and this is a very healthy limit that to the willingness to tax people and activities in the different countries. the other point that I also ought to raise is that from another perspective, tax rebellion is at the heart of the construction of a republican model of government. If you think about the Carta Magna or the Glorious Revolution or the Tea Party, all those historical events that were so important in building the, let's say, the republican system that we have mostly around the world, not all over the world, have to do with tax rebellions and people saying, no, we don't want any taxes anymore. So that has played a very important role in history.
I come from a place in which on our cars, the license plates say no taxation without representation because we do not have that representation and yet we pay the taxes. Gustavo, I'm wondering your take on what you just heard.
Yeah, certainly. And, I started in my introductory remarks talking about not just the importance of taxation for the provision of public goods and services, redistribution, but the third point I made was about accountability and sort of this nexus between, people and government. And I think it speaks to what you just said and the sense that at the end of the day, society needs to make sure that governments are accountable not only in the quality of the goods and services that they provide, but also in terms of waste, in terms of what they are doing with the money that they receive from taxpayers. And this is something that is very important, that I think it can contribute to not only people feeling that they have a stake in the system, which can prevent, other problems, but also in generating institutions and means of oversight of government and monitoring that I think is also very healthy for a well-functioning system overall.
Do we know if left versus right-wing governments are more effective than the other at effectively taxing their people and collecting those taxes?
Historically, I think there's an association of sort of the left associated with a big government or greater services provided by government in more aspects, more spheres of the economy, and that there's more of an inclination to tax at higher levels. And the right, the opposite, associated with smaller government and so on. But in recent years, and really depends on the region, in terms of the effectiveness of actually bringing in those resources, there are really mixed results. In Latin America, it's hard to point to right of center or left of center governments as being more effective at this. In part, I think it speaks to the challenges of in systems, again, in Latin America in particular, in systems where the quality of those services one gets in return is not particularly high, then governments struggle to get people to pay as much in taxes as they should. But I think this is a common problem, and this is something that there are differences in terms of the government's willingness to enforce. And sometimes there's selective enforcement. Sometimes, it becomes political whether you really enforce the tax laws and who is really getting that enforcement and who's not. So, it's complicated in this sense.
Everyone here at this table has spent significant parts of your careers invested in this topic that we're discussing, and it shows. I'm wondering what alternatives then you've come up with or you've seen to the current order that we should be looking at. Pedro, maybe I'll start with you because I know that you work in emerging technologies, digital currencies. Do you see a route there that we should be looking at when we're talking about alternatives?
I mean, I think that the topic of money itself doesn't get talked about enough in these sort of conversations. Just because, like, as a footnote, or not, it's not really a footnote, but there's an embedded tax in the money system, which is through inflation. And that hits the poor immeasurably more than it hits the wealthy. So there's that big issue. And I think that the emergence of something like Bitcoin or like stable coins, but mostly Bitcoin, is a fundamental change or an alteration in how the system can fund itself, how the system can operate, how the system sort of keeps itself afloat. I think that Bitcoin is one of the most, if not the most important technologies that exists. There's arguments that say that no, because the internet is more important, because Bitcoin is like a subgenre of the internet. But I guess since it's applied to money, I do think it deserves something else. But I do think that you're seeing an emergence of an industry and of communities around the world that surround themselves on principles like openness, like transparency, like fairness, like permissionless, that are around things like Bitcoin and like cryptocurrencies, that and rightfully so. Like the state, you can think that it's essential, but it's proven to the world that it's not really doing its job properly. It's very opaque. It's supportive mostly of corporations or multinationals or high net worth individuals. And so the emergence of things like Bitcoin are an obvious alternative and a solution. It serves as a check against excessive spending. It serves as a check against inflation. It defunds the state to a degree, and it forces the state to provide much better infrastructure if you want me to actually continue to use your money. And so I think a lot of, like Martin was saying at the beginning, that a lot of his gripe goes against the idea of coercion. I think that a lot of my gripe with how the society and system works today is how the money operates, how the financial system operates, how the banking industry excludes billions of people around the world and doesn't offer any sort of means of financial access. And if we want a society to flourish, then it needs to have financial access. It needs to have a money that saves over time. We live in a hyper-connected world. We need to be able to operate where I can send money around the world instantly for no fees, and you get the full amount that gets there instantly. So yeah, I think that Bitcoin doesn't get talked about enough. I think it has at one point it has poor marketing, and at the same time it has really good marketing, because people who take some time to properly understand it, understand its value proposition, and they see it for the potential that it has, for the financially excluded, for minorities around the world, for people that live sort of subjugated by the dollar system. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see countries and communities and industries and companies pop up around these sort of ideas and principles that govern something like Bitcoin.
Martin, do you see it as a viable solution when we're talking about alternatives?
Definitely. I'm quite optimistic on that. Of course, I cannot foresee what is going to happen, but that is definitely a challenge to let's say, the monopoly of government. And I hope it will keep on growing and develop in ways that we cannot even imagine now. Now, I would briefly changing the subject. I will also point out that we have been talking about the taxes here, but from a, let's say, logical point of view, we should not forget that we should talk first about expenditures. Government expenditure. That's the first discussion. What government does, what government should do. And once we have a definition on that, and then we should talk about taxes. How do we fund this? So it seems to me that this issue is closely linked to what the government does or should do. And then there go to taxes.
So what should taxes fund?
I think different societies have different needs, and it's maybe not that different if we think about it in terms of a family or a household, right? Well, different households have different needs depending on size, depending on, backgrounds and so on, and that in turn should inform what you're spending your money on, what the priorities are, and when we scale it up to countries, well, it might be very difficult for everyone to agree on a particular goal, but we can think of majorities or different ways of organizing preferences in society that can at least inform the direction of these expenditures. But it is true that even countries that tax at high levels with respect to their GDP don't necessarily show great results when it comes to spending, and others that maybe don't tax as much but do a lot more with that money. So there isn't necessarily the fact that a country might tax quite a bit, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll show results and that it'll put that government to good use, money to good use.
Why is that? Do we know?
Well, there are so many factors. So, corruption is a big one, at least in some parts of the world, where you really have a lot of that money. You have the leaky bucket, right? That from the taxpayer to the actual service or good that you're trying to finance, there are so many hands that took a piece of it that are not necessarily part of the vision as to how that money should be spent. So that's one. Sometimes it has to do with obstacles in political obstacles to how that money would be spent, and lack of agreement as to what these goals should be. Anyway, there are several factors, but let me give you just one example. Brazil for Latin America is the one country in the region that actually taxes at the levels that one would expect given the size of its economy. So the levels of taxation as a share of GDP are the highest in the region and are at the level, sort of the worldwide expectation. But when one looks at outcomes for education in Brazil, public education, they're very, very poor. And this is something that, that accountability with citizens is important, and just really to push governments to deliver on these expenditures. I think ex ante, it's difficult to say, well, because we're taxing this much, we need to spend this much. But there certainly has to be a connection, because if you're not spending the money that you're collecting, that's a problem. Or if you are over-collecting for the money that you are actually spending, that's also a problem. So there, it's I think, an important relationship between the two, but one that is difficult to establish, because in any society there will be so many different views as to priorities and so on.
Do you appreciate that difficulty? Do you agree with what you just heard?
Yes, I think that one way around, in a sense, of problems like that would be deeper decentralization of government, moving everything down from the national level to the state level, down from the state level to the local government. That will help, because people may be familiar with some problems in the neighborhood or in the district they live, but it's very difficult that they pay attention to the large problems at the national level, or the fiscal deficit or revenues. So it seems to me that it would be beneficial, let's say, if we'll bring down the different levels of government, as well as taxation down to the local level.
Sanjit, I want to bring this back to how we got to this part of the conversation, which is thinking about alternatives. And in your research, have you found that there are viable alternatives people have found to discuss these issues of either rising inequality or unjust taxation, or taxation that doesn't hit where it should hit?
But that's not the area actually that I have personally been researching in. So the Western tradition in economics stays very much within a system where governments have to perform a certain number of roles, which are considered extremely important, and we've spoken a lot about them. And to my mind, short of voluntary action, performing some amazing miracles, it's not clear to me how else, or your country might have natural resources that are so vast that you don't need taxation.
So we're thinking oil, we're thinking natural gas.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Short of that, it does not seem to me to be a practical option, but to go for some form of taxation. As I've said, What kind of taxes you should have, the mix of taxes, the levels of taxes, that's up for debate. And that obviously depends on what kind of country you live in, what kind of needs the country has. Yeah.
Gustavo.
Yeah, if I could add, some of my research focuses on the political obstacles to taxation and the connection between the money that one contributes to the system and how that money is spent is something that really motivates people to actually pay taxes. And I wrote a book. I'm going to make a plug here. The title of the book is Contemporary State Building, Elite Taxation and Public Safety in Latin America. And the book focuses on experiences around the region in which governments and the wealthiest sectors of society sometimes came together, sometimes maybe it wasn't as cooperative, but the idea is that explored ways to increase the level of taxation among the wealthiest in order to address a public safety imperative, deteriorating public safety situation that in some places reached critical levels. And what I find in the book, the book focuses on the experiences in Colombia and Costa Rica and Mexico and El Salvador, different parts of the region. And what I find is that elites, again, no one wants to pay taxes. But if they have, a pressing need that is public safety, in which even in some places like, say, Colombia in the 2000s or the late 90s, it was very hard to go from one city to the next because of fear of being kidnapped, because of major violence taking place. The wealthiest were willing to pay more if they knew that those funds would go to what they cared about, which was public safety. So, wealth taxes were structured in a way that included some degrees of oversight so that they knew, okay, the money is going to the issue that we care about, and we can see that it's actually been spent for that purpose. And something interesting, that there's quite a bit of variation in the region. The experiments that worked, or the circumstances that were conducive to this working, and others in which it didn't work. And where it didn't work is when governments sort of try to impose this on economic elites without their input, or in which elites were sidelined without that ability to sort of be part of the process and make sure that those funds were spent in public safety. So some of the key lessons from this, in my mind, have to do with the concern that governments either will waste the money, spend it on something else that is not a priority. And if we can bring that connection between the taxes that come in and the expenditures, if we can make it tighter, then people might be more willing to pay taxes at the end of the day.
Can I just add one interesting point to that? The willingness to pay taxes being spoken about in various domains. Now, my main area of research is on individual behavior. Most of the questions we are posing are system-wide questions. And one thing that's important in human behavior is a taste for instant gratification. Okay. So, for instance, we all make New Year's resolutions starting in October sometime. But come the new year, once we are a few days or weeks into the new year, once it's very close by, we often give in to temptation, and a lot of those New Year's resolutions don't stick with us. So this taste for instant gratification has been very important for a range of what's known as sin goods. For example, smoking. Now, governments engage in a variety of regulations in order to deter certain activities. Smoking is one of them. For example, the way we engage in packaging of cigarettes. Another is putting excise duties on cigarettes. Now, typically, we don't like taxes and we like to pay less of them. With self-control problems, I would like some kind of mechanism that would help me control my self-control problems, my urge to have the next fag. If the excise taxes are really high, then that might reduce my consumption of cigarettes. It gives me an external mechanism by which I can commit to my future selves that, look, I'm going to smoke less. That's exactly what they found in Canada. Smokers actually supported higher excise taxes. And so the willingness to pay for taxes ultimately could be traced down to a behavioral factor, which is something that, the sort of research I do.
I want to posit that behavioral factor over to you, Pedro, with Bitcoin and digital currencies because there was so much passion when we got to the talk of alternatives, and you said this is something we need to be talking more about. So I want to give it its due. What are central bank digital currencies and how will they actually help in this conversation? How will they help with taxation?
So central bank digital currencies are essentially digital representations of the currency that already exists, that's government-backed. If you ask me, they're probably one of the biggest threats that we have as individual citizens at the end of the day, because what can they bring essentially? More control, more surveillance. Unfortunately, the internet, how it's been built, and governments, how they're rolling out, you know this probably quite well, better than me, in the UK, with an excess of surveillance of just the general population. What happens when that starts to get applied to the money system? What happens where if you have, let's say, a government that is completely in control, because right now you have a sort of check and balance between the banking industry and the government. But what happens when those two coalesce and the government is in charge of everything? And you have a less than democratic government in power, and there's social unrest, civil unrest, people take to the streets. Yeah, there's all sorts of things. And you start to clamp down on people's bank accounts. You start to restrict how much money they're using for specific needs. This happened during the Hong Kong protests, and this can happen and I expect to see that to get rolled out into the future in different jurisdictions. You can see it, for example, in Europe, in specific areas where there's a big battle against consumption, or there's a big battle for climate change. What happens if you start to get green credits and you start to use your maximum amount of green credits, and that gets applied to the money system? So there's arguments in favor of central bank digital currencies in that it makes the supply of money, or the supply of the allocation of resources to the individual, a bit more seamless. It digitalizes services. You can start to interconnect things in much more easy and comfortable ways. I tend to err on the side, when it comes to this specific thing, on the threat that it poses. The internet is built on a lot of surveillance, and I can just see a lot of those tools getting applied to the money. And so, yeah, I think that this is actually a big problem that doesn't get talked about also enough, how central banks' digital currencies will probably, for one, enlarge the government in ways that we're not entirely sure that we want for them to be enlarged. And so, yeah, it's still a working conversation. China has been doing it with the renminbi. There's pilot programs in Barbados. There's all sorts of, there's working groups in Chile and Argentina. I think something like, I don't remember the last time I checked, but there were dozens of countries that have working groups that are looking towards it. On the purpose of taxation, I mean, that can also become a tricky thing, because if the government can sort of drain you, I'm going to, obviously this is a bit of an extreme, but if they can drain you and then they can use that money for whatever they want, or how taxation kind of operates right now, that can become a problem. I'm not saying that people necessarily, because I'm not necessarily saying that people want to, or that the government is just going to come and drain your bank account. But if the government starts to get extreme control over your finances, that can become a bigger problem, and it can go beyond taxation. It can start to apply to how people behave, whether you want to nudge them in specific directions, whether you want to, the way people use their money is a clear indication of their preferences, of their priorities, of their interests. What happens when you have one specific organization that knows exactly what Gustavo likes to do, what he does it? We're animals of patterns. There's a clear indication of what we do. And so I think that that's a very dangerous slope that we're playing with the eventual rollout of CBDCs around the world, and something that I think that we need to push a pause on and start to think about. Because you have also the second thing, they're not going to fix the problems that already exist. They're not going
It would fix evasion, though, right?
It would fix evasion, but it wouldn't fix inflation. And inflation is a hidden tax that hits disproportionately the poorer classes and the middle classes than it does the wealthy. It wouldn't fix the unbanked. It wouldn't fix a lot of like access to financial services. So, yeah, I see there's more downfalls than there is just like putting a plug in fixing tax avoidance or tax evasion. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the people that are doing tax avoidance aren't doing it necessarily because of the technologies like this that appear. They're doing it because of they're doing it because of passports. They're doing it because of geographical circumstances, smart tax accountants. There's a whole infrastructure around the world built so that you can avoid tax if you actually want to. There's an interesting question, which is, and this ties back into the Bitcoin topic, we're kind of okay as a society with allowing billionaires to avoid taxes. Now it's a big conversation, but we're kind of okay because they've been doing it forever. There's a bunch of concerns about tax avoidance when it comes to the emergence of digital currencies. Why? Because now individuals and the lower and the middle classes are able to play by the same rule as the elites. The elites don't like that. And so that's why there's this big campaign in favor of CBDCs against Bitcoin and digital currencies, because they can see the playing field is starting to level and they see the threat that's happening. And I think that goes beyond taxation and goes a little bit more into the heart of sort of inequality and the rules that govern society.
So a potential alternative, but not without its pitfalls. Do you think it's possible to achieve fairness without paying taxes?
What do you mean by fairness?
I guess you tell me. Just a just and equal society, equality.
But equality on treatment, let's say, not on outcomes.
Yes.
Do you mean equality in outcomes?
I mean equality in treatment first, and then we can think about outcomes next.
Because they are not compatible, I would say. If you want, people are different. They have different qualities. They have different histories. If you want to make them all equal, you should have to treat them differently. So you can have both things at the same time. I'd rather go to treat everybody in the same way. And since we are different, we are going to get different results. You know? But it seems to me that, and I'm going to be hard on this, I say, if you want to reach that point of equal results, that will end up in 1984, a thing like that. If you go straight to that society, that will be a totalitarian society, because it goes against the human nature in the sense that we are different, that we have different perspectives with different preferences and different resources.
Gustavo, same question to you.
Well, you know, I like to tie it to the question of technology and Bitcoin and privacy and sort of opportunity and these things we've been discussing. And I think there is a lot of promise with new technologies on so many dimensions. But that same use of the technology to avoid or to reduce evasion is important. I think the use of cryptocurrencies is compatible with taxation, and some different governments have been following different, let's say, patterns or rules. Some places, let's say, Bitcoin is taxed as capital gains, such that if I buy at a certain price and then I sell at a later price, that's how it's taxed. In others, it's also taxed as in terms of transactions for the purchase of goods and services, the way that any other currency might. And I'm part of a study by Cornell's Tech Policy Institute that is a public opinion study of Bitcoin. And it's so interesting to see that the understanding worldwide of what Bitcoin is and the prospect, and same for stablecoins and all these other cryptocurrencies, is so low. But people are excited about it, and it's something that I think has a lot of room and that governments will have to grapple with in terms of how this might be compatible with prosperity and how to harness it. But that transparency in some, people think of Bitcoin, maybe the concern as being something that hides from governments, but there's also sort of the publicness of the blockchain that then lends itself to this there's traceability of transactions that I think also holds a lot of promise for on the taxation side. I think it is important to provide a world in which people have the same opportunities no matter where they come from. And I'll emphasize that I mean here equality of opportunity. And I think taxation and just government plays an important role in that, in providing, say, a basic floor so that people's health is there's a floor, and that then people have that opportunity to prosper, that education, there's a minimum level. I think everyone benefits from that education, from others being educated as well. And that these things generate externalities that are important, and there's a role for governments to play. And certainly taxation is the way to fund governments toward these goals.
Pedro, same question. Is fairness even the right question? Is that the goal? And is it possible without taxation?
It's a great question. I guess, and to Martin's point, what do we define as fairness? What are we looking for? What is justice? What are you
looking for?
I'm looking for just a society where everybody's happier, where people have more free time, where people's lives aren't entirely based around their jobs. My generation, millennials, we all have 2 to 3 to 4 jobs sometimes. We're all social media addicted, the aspiration of owning a house is a foregone. It's a utopia for me and my friends, let alone for my nephews or for the people that come after me. And I personally don't see, I struggle sometimes to see how the state is creating the opportunities or the conditions for that to turn around. I don't see the private sector doing it either. I'm a firm believer of decentralizing things, bringing things back to local governments, bringing things back to, for example, in the workplace, back to cooperatives or alternative forms of organization. But I do think taxation is a need. I just think that the opacity with which the state operates and the institutions around us operate kind of put a dent in the argument for blind taxation and the idea that we should be paying because it has to exist, because some of it is going to trickle down. We can be doing a much better job, but it's a multifactorial problem that has a whole bunch of issues at play. Can we achieve it without taxation? I want to think we could, but I lean in the direction that we can't, at least not in one go. It would be like sort of driving a car and trying to fix trying to remove all 4 wheels at the same time as it was driving and change it back up. If there's a gradual way of doing it, I'd be in favor of it. If you ask me, I do think that the state does create a lot of problems despite creating a lot of opportunities. And I think the combination of civil society, private sector, and the state in that sort of Venn diagram, that's where we can find how we can do it with different sorts of technologies, with different sorts of conversations, acknowledging that the world is global now, acknowledging that the internet brings a lot of good things and a lot of problems. And how we can traverse that is also important, because we also have to keep in mind regulation, whether that's tax design or anything else, is slow, and innovation usually gets hampered by it. And so we need to also be creating, being like, all right, I'm going to step back for a second, let this happen within some sort of framework, obviously, and then I'll have to be able to fix it, or then I'll have to put things here, take things another way. But I think it's a tough world we're living in right now. It's definitely not fair. It's definitely not getting fairer. But I do keep a sliver of hope that there are some things that are getting done that we can make it a little bit better for some of us, or for all of us. But when I say some of us, for those that aren't lucky enough to live in the kind of lifestyle that we all want to be living in.
Right. Well,
Sorry, may I add something on this issue
briefly.
of fairness?
Briefly.
I think that we should decide a definition between fairness of process and fairness of outcomes, of results. These are two very different things. One is not compatible with the other. If we want, I'm going to take an example that was brought by a Harvard philosopher, Robert Nozick. He died a few years ago, but he makes this example. Let's suppose a world that we are all equal. We have all the same income, all of us. And then suddenly comes, sorry, I'm going to use a local example here, Lionel Messi. You know who Lionel Messi is.
A local example that's international. Yes,
okay,
please.
So everybody starts looking at him, and you see, oh, this guy is different. I want this guy to my club.
Mm-hmm.
And then they will go and talk with Messi's father, and Messi say, okay, Leo will play for you in this condition. Everybody will buy the tickets, and then in this box here, they will put 50% to Leo, okay? They agree, come. He starts working and starts winning all the championships that you can imagine. At the end of the year, the situation that we have is that Messi is rich and we are all the same as before. The question is that unfair? It's a very different distribution of income, very different. But is it unfair? We did it. We put the money in the box to see and watch him. So how can we say? So the process is important, not the outcome.
Well, thank you for that clarification.
I do think just to touch on that a second, I do think it's a nice anecdote. And I do think that there's fundamental differences between the talent of someone like Lionel Messi and the wealth that have accumulated around the world, billionaires. So I appreciate it, but I disagree with it.
We've opened a box just at the end, but I know that there's more to unpack there. But I want to give you a chance to answer that final question that sparked this.
Yeah, sure. Think about the first industrial revolution. Between 1806 and 1820, the wages of artisan weavers suddenly became half. Suddenly. Okay? You go and try to talk fairness to these people. From 1980 onwards, the increased automation that we observed has reduced real wages in the US. Okay. And if you look at the trend now in modern AI, now it's not the low-skilled jobs that are going to be lost. They're going to be lost as well. But also the middle-income jobs are going to be lost. So we're now going to have massive issues in societies with increasing unemployments in the low-income levels and the middle-income levels. I don't see any other way other than redistributive taxation in order to ensure that we don't have civil wars in societies.
No.
So quite to the contrary, the role of taxes and redistributive taxes is going to increase. Governments are already scrambling on dealing with the fallout from AI-related unemployment and trying to create safety nets in advance. So redistributive taxes have been very important, but they haven't been quite as important as what we're going to see them in the future. And all tax systems strive to achieve balance between efficiency and fairness. So if fairness of any form, and we talk about process fairness, the artisan weavers who lost half their wages, you go and talk about process fairness to them or outcome fairness, which one is it? It's very difficult to make sense of it. The nature of technical progress often is labor saving, and it benefits disproportionately holders of capital. And most people would not wish to live in a society which condemns increasingly greater percentage of people to levels of income that they've just not been accustomed to. So I think taxation is going to be increasingly important.
I've learned so much at this table, and I want to leave us with just one question, because I think I can already imagine those who are watching and listening to this wondering. So rapid fire, just sort of about a sentence, if you could answer in that length of length of answer. Do you think you pay enough taxes personally? Gustavo.
I think I do. I live in the United States, so I guess it depends where you live. You can answer this question differently, but I think I do. And you've opened quite a box here with this last question, and I will get into that. But it really depends also where you are in the wealth distribution, how much in taxes you pay, at least nominally, and if indeed you fulfill your tax obligations, you can end up paying quite a bit of taxes, even the middle class. Anyway, so a lot of nuance in there. But I'll just say yes, I think I do.
Pedro.
Yeah, I think I do. It's also hard for me to say I do because I don't exactly know where my tax is going to, and so and this is a topic that I might have been insisting a lot, but if I could see it, I could say, no, I'm not paying enough. Or if I could see it, I could say I'm paying much more than I should. But I think I am.
Same question?
Well, just for perspective, I pay a marginal tax rate of 40%. So every £100 that I earn, I pay 40 in income taxes.
40.
40. The remaining 60 that I bring home with me, I pay 20% GST on that. So I pay £18 on that. So I'm getting at the end of the day £42 for every £100 that I earn. What I do observe is increasing hardship amongst the worst off in the UK. So the local council now no longer has enough money to cut grass on the verges outside. People whose children are disabled are finding it extremely difficult to get social support and care workers to come in because the government is running out of money. I could do the crib and say governments ought to be more efficient in the way they spend my money. Or I could just keep looking at these people and thinking, fine, it's their choice, they're poor. No, I'm not that heartless. So I wouldn't mind if the government asked me to contribute a few extra bucks to help the poor.
Wow. And GST is?
20%. Goods and services tax. It's the excise tax. It's when you buy something at a shop. So necessities like food items, most basic food items would be exempt from it because otherwise the poor would find it extremely difficult to buy. But most of the items that you would buy would be taxed around that rate.
Martín, we will end where we started. Do you think you pay enough taxes?
Definitely. I think, on the one hand, that those who favor taxes should be paying more voluntarily. Why don't they do that? And the second is, yes, I do pay more, particularly if I take into account what I get. I end up paying twice. I pay taxes for government education, but I need to pay a private education. Same with the health system, and I need to buy a health insurance. And same with security. That you need to live in a neighborhood giving you private security because the government does not. So I'm paying twice. And that seems to me it's paying too much compared with what I get.
Gus, thank you so much for this conversation, for the points, the anecdotes, the stories, and for sharing your own personal reflections at the end. I think they're very telling. I saved them for the end because I know they could be individual shows in their own selves. But thank you very much for your willingness to be part of this conversation. And thank you for watching. Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.